On my 53rd wedding anniversary, my daughter brought us a gift she said was from her heart. My wife unwrapped it slowly, the way she does everything, carefully, like the moment itself deserves respect. Inside the box was an antique mental clock, dark walnut, brass fittings, the kind you see in old farmhouses along the Annapolis Valley. Beautiful. My wife held it up and smiled. Then she tilted it slightly and frowned. "Walter," she said. She still calls me by my full name when something doesn't sit right. "Why does this feel heavier on one side?" I took it from her. She was right. Before I tell you what we found inside that clock, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. If you're a grandparent, or if you have aging parents you love, you need to hear this. It could matter more than you think. 3 weeks after that anniversary dinner, my daughter was escorted out of the Nova Scotia probate court in tears, and her lawyer faced a Law Society investigation. But it all started with a clock. My wife Irene and I have been married 53 years. We met at Dalhousie University in Halifax in 1971. She was studying education. I was finishing my accounting degree. We bought our house in Bedford in 1984, raised 2 children there, watched the maple in the backyard grow from a sapling to something that shades the whole yard by July. The house is paid off. We're comfortable. Not wealthy by any stretch, but after decades of careful living, my pension from the province, Irene's from the school board, our RRSPs and a modest investment portfolio, we've built something solid. Somewhere around $520,000 in total assets, including the house. Not a fortune, enough that people notice. Our daughter Corinne is 51. She lives in Dartmouth with her husband, a man named Brent, who I've never fully trusted, though I kept that to myself for most of 20 years. Our son, Eric, is 48. He lives in Calgary. He calls every Sunday. Corinne calls when she needs something. I don't say that to be cruel, I say it because it's true, and this story only makes sense if you understand who we were to each other before it started. The anniversary dinner was on a Saturday in October. Corinne had suggested we do it at her place rather than a restaurant. More personal, she said, more meaningful. Irene was touched. I was a little surprised. Corinne had never been much for hosting, but I said nothing. The house smelled like store-bought rotisserie chicken and something lemony she'd sprayed to cover it. Brent was pleasant in the way men are pleasant when they're performing pleasantness. He refilled wine glasses without being asked, laughed at the right moments, asked about my golf game. I ate and smiled and noticed things. After dessert, a cake from a Dartmouth bakery, not homemade, though Corinne said she'd baked it, she brought out the clock. The presentation was elaborate. Tissue paper, a velvet-lined box, a card that said, "For all the time you've given us, with love." Irene read the card twice. She's the sentimental one. She teared up a little. I watched Corinne watch her, and there was something in my daughter's expression I couldn't name. Not warmth exactly. Something more like calculation, wearing warmth's clothes. The drive home to Bedford was quiet. Irene held the clock on her lap. "Around the Mackay Bridge," she said, "it's beautiful, isn't it?" I said yes. She said, "But it's heavy." I said, "Antique clocks often are." She said, "Not like this." That night, after Irene went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the clock. I'm a retired accountant, 40 years of looking at numbers that don't add up. You develop a certain instinct for things that are off. I turned the clock over, examined the base, a small panel on the underside, secured with 2 Phillips screws that were slightly newer than the rest of the hardware. I found a flathead and opened it. Inside, nestled against the clockwork mechanism, was a small rectangular device I didn't recognize at first. Black plastic about the size of a book of matches with a tiny green indicator light. I took a photo of it on my phone and sat very still for a long moment. I'd seen something similar on a home security segment on CBC Marketplace 2 years before. A GPS tracker. Active. Blinking. I didn't wake, Irene. I sat at that table until past midnight, and I made myself think clearly, the way I used to approach audit discrepancies. Something is wrong. What do I actually know, and what am I only afraid of? What I knew, the clock was heavier than it should be. There was a tracking device inside it. My daughter had given it to us and wanted us to keep it in our home. What I was afraid of, that this wasn't the beginning of the problem. That this was just the first thing I could see. I thought back over the past several months. The questions Corinne had begun asking at family dinners. Not aggressive, never direct, just present. Do you still drive on the highway, Dad? I worry about night driving at your age. And once, after I'd forgotten a dentist appointment, it happens, Dad, you're 74, it's normal. Said gently, said in front of Brent, said in front of their son, our grandson Noah, who's 12 and notices everything. There had been other things. A pamphlet left on our kitchen counter about retirement transitions and senior living options in HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, that neither Irene nor I had asked for or remembered bringing home. A conversation Irene mentioned that she'd had with Corinne on the phone, where Corinne had apparently said, "I just think it's worth considering while you still have options." Irene had been hurt by that. I'd told her not to read into it. I had been wrong to tell her that. I took the clock to my study, set it on the shelf, and before I went to bed, I searched 2 things on my laptop. First, how to report suspected elder financial abuse in Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia Department of Justice has a dedicated line through the Public Trustee's Office. Second, elder law solicitor, Halifax NS. One name came up repeatedly, a woman named Janet Forsyth, a solicitor with 22 years' experience in elder law and estate protection. Her firm was on Barrington Street. Her reviews mentioned elder financial abuse cases specifically. I wrote her name and number on a piece of paper and put it in my desk drawer. Then I went to bed. I didn't sleep. Monday morning, while Irene was at her book club at the Spring Garden Road Library, I called Janet Forsyth's office. I explained the situation briefly. The assistant asked if I could come in that week. I said I could come in that day. Janet Forsyth is a small woman, maybe 60, with reading glasses she looks over rather than through, and the particular steadiness of someone who has heard terrible things and learned not to flinch at them. I put the tracker on her desk. She examined it without touching it. She asked to see the photos I'd taken. How long have things felt off? She asked. A few months, I said, but I kept explaining it away. She nodded like she'd heard that sentence 800 times. She turned to her computer. I want to check something before we go further. Can you give me your full legal name and your daughter's? I gave her both. She typed. Her expression didn't change, but her typing slowed. Mr. Ashford, she said, are you aware that an application for personal directorship was filed with the Nova Scotia Supreme Court 18 days ago? The room did something strange. It tilted slightly, or I did. Personal directorship is the Nova Scotia equivalent of guardianship. It gives someone legal authority over another person's finances and personal decisions. No, I said, I was not. She turned the monitor toward me. My name was at the top of the document. Applicant, Corinne Ashford Mercer. Represented by counsel, a solicitor named Derek Holloway. The filing alleged demonstrated cognitive decline, risk to personal welfare, and inability to manage financial decisions independently. It was filed October 3rd. 4 days before our anniversary dinner. 4 days before the clock arrived in our home. The anniversary dinner, I said, motioning to myself. I'm sorry. She had us to dinner, gave us the clock. She wanted the tracker in our house before the hearing, She wanted evidence. My voice was level. I've always been better in a crisis than before one. It's the waiting that undoes me. Janet closed the document. The solicitor of record, Derek Holloway, I want to show you something. She opened another file. In the past 2 years, Holloway has filed 6 similar applications in Nova Scotia. 3 in Halifax, 2 in the Valley, 1 in Cape Breton, all involving elderly individuals with substantial assets. All applications supported by family members. In 5 of those 6 cases, the subject was placed in a residential facility within 90 days of the application being approved. And their estates depleted. In cases where the appointed director was also the primary beneficiary, asset liquidation happened quickly. In one case, a family home in Wolfville, assessed at $440,000, was sold within 60 days of placement. She paused. The individual died 8 months after being placed. I sat with that for a moment. They would need evidence for the hearing, I said. Yes. Documented incidents of confusion, memory failure, inability to manage daily tasks. The tracker tells me they were monitoring your movements, probably looking for patterns, appointments missed, unusual routes, anything that could be framed as disorientation. They'll manufacture something if they need to, I said. It wasn't a question. Possibly, which is why the next 2 weeks matter enormously. Janet folded her hands. Here's what I need from you. First, the tracker. We document it, photograph it, have it examined by someone who can confirm its make and model and transmission history. Second, any recordings you have, any texts, any written communication from your daughter about your health or capabilities. Third, anyone who can speak to your competency, your GP, your accountant, friends who see you regularly. I thought of my Thursday morning golf group. 4 of us, been playing together since 1998. My GP, Dr. Cartry, who's been treating me for 11 years and who most recently told me my blood work was disgracefully healthy for your age. My former colleagues at the provincial auditor's office. My whole life was witnesses, if it came to that. What about the device itself? I asked. Can we trace who's receiving the signal? We'll try. The tracker will likely have a registered account attached to it, either in your daughter's name or her husband's. She made a note. Mr. Ashford, I want to ask you something directly. Is there anyone else in your immediate family who might have knowledge of this arrangement? I thought of Eric in Calgary. Then I thought of Noah, our grandson, 12 years old, who'd been quiet at the anniversary dinner in a way that wasn't his usual quietness, who'd looked at me once across the table with an expression I'd read as boredom and now was reading differently. My grandson was there, I said. He's 12. I don't think he's involved, but I think he may have heard things. Janet wrote something down. Keep him in mind. I drove home along the Bedford highway with the radio off. The harbour was grey and flat, the kind of October afternoon that feels like the end of something. I thought about Irene. She didn't know yet. I had to tell her, and I had to tell her carefully, because Irene has a heart condition, nothing serious, controlled with medication, but stress affects her, and I was not going to have this thing harm her before we'd even had the chance to fight back. I told her that evening, after dinner at the kitchen table. I put the tracker on the table between us. I told her everything I knew and everything Janet had told me. Irene listened without interrupting, which is not her natural mode. When I finished, she was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, "The pamphlet." "What?" "The pamphlet about senior living. I didn't bring it home." "You didn't bring it home. Corinne was here 2 weeks before the anniversary. She came to drop off Noah for the afternoon. She must have left it then." She looked at me. "I thought I was imagining things, Walter. I thought I was being ungenerous to my own daughter." "So did I said. Irene reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand is small and very warm. "What do we do?" We fight, I said. 2 days later, Noah came to our house after school. He does this twice a week, takes the bus from his school in Dartmouth to the Bedford terminal, and I pick him up. Irene makes him a snack, and he sits at the kitchen island and does his homework. It's been our routine for 4 years. That Tuesday, he was quieter than usual. He ate his apple slices without comment. I sat across from him with my coffee. "You okay, bud?" I said. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his homework, a social studies sheet about Canadian provinces. Then he said, "Grandpa, did Mum talk to you about anything recently? About you and Grandma?" I chose my words carefully. Not directly. Why? He was quiet again. Then she had me practice what to say to a social worker. She said someone might ask me questions about whether you and Grandma are managing okay, and she told me what to answer. My coffee cup was very still in my hand. "What did she tell you to say?" Noah looked at me, and his face was doing something complicated, the face of a kid who knows he's caught between loyalties that shouldn't be in conflict. She said to say that Grandpa gets confused sometimes, that you drove the wrong way to Canadian Tire once, that you forgot Grandma's prescription pickup. He paused. "But you didn't. You went to a different Canadian Tire because the one on Lacewood was out of what you needed, and Grandma's prescription, she picked that up herself. I was there, I remember." I put my coffee cup down. "Did you tell your mum that?" "She said I was misremembering." His jaw tightened in a way that was very much Irene's expression on a younger face. "I wasn't misremembering." I looked at my grandson for a long moment. "Noah, I need you to know that you haven't done anything wrong. And I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can tell me the truth without worrying about what happens after, okay?" He nodded. "Have you heard your parents talk about what would happen to this house? To Grandma and me? Where we might live?" He looked at his apple slices. "Brent said that if you guys moved somewhere with proper care, they could help manage things, that it was the responsible thing." He looked up. He said the house could be sold and the money put somewhere that worked for everyone. I didn't know what that meant until I thought about it more. I thanked him. I told him that whatever happened next, I was glad he was honest and that it didn't change anything between us. He hugged me when he left. A long hug, longer than 12-year-olds usually give. That night I called Janet. I told her about Noah. She asked if I thought he'd be willing to speak to the court. I said I didn't know. I said I wouldn't put him in that position if I could avoid it. She said she understood, but that the coaching, a child being given false accounts of events to repeat to authorities, was itself a serious matter. I also told her something I'd been sitting on. My son Eric had called on Sunday, as he always does. I'd told him carefully that we were dealing with something. He'd been quiet. Then he'd said, "I know, Dad. Corinne called me in September. She wanted me to support the application." Another silence. I told her no. I told her you were fine. She stopped calling me after that. He said no, I told Janet. Then he may be willing to testify to that conversation. He's already booked a flight to Halifax, I said. The next week was deliberate and precise. Janet worked quickly. The tracking device was examined by a digital forensics consultant she used regularly, a former RCMP officer who transitioned into private practice. The device was a commercially available GPS tracker, registered to an email account in Brent's name. It had been transmitting our location data twice per day to that account since the evening of our anniversary dinner. The transmissions included our home address as a static overnight location, a pattern of our weekly movements, my Thursday golf, Irene's Tuesday book club, my Monday appointments at the Bedford Mall, and 2 instances where I had driven to Janet's office on Barrington Street. They knew I'd seen a solicitor. That meant they knew something had changed. Janet called me on a Thursday morning, her voice measured. "They've escalated. Holloway filed a motion for an emergency competency assessment yesterday. They're claiming you've become erratic, that you confronted your daughter aggressively at a recent family gathering, their language, and that this represents an escalation of concerning behavior. I haven't spoken to my daughter since the anniversary dinner, I said. I know. The fabrication is documented by the simple fact of your phone records and your movements, but it tells us they're scared. She paused. Walter, is there any reason for them to believe you've been contacted by the tracker's manufacturer for account breach notifications? Something that would indicate Brent knows the tracker has been discovered. I thought about it. I opened the panel on the base of the clock. If the device was motion sensitive, it likely logged a handling event. They may have known you found it within hours. Then everything since has been reactionary, I said. They've been improvising. And improvisation leaves traces, Janet said. Here's where we stand. We have the tracker and forensic report. We have Brent's registered email account. We have Eric's testimony about the September law call. We have Dr. Caterie's professional assessment of your cognitive and physical health. We have your former colleague, Ted Barlow, who's agreed to speak to your financial management, the man you've been corresponding with by email about your investment portfolio, which is managed without assistance. We have Noah's account, which I prefer to keep as a last resort. And we have your 53 years of independent life. She paused again. The hearing is in 8 days. Eric arrived on a Wednesday. He's heavier than he used to be, grey at the temples, but he has the same way of standing in a doorway that he's had since he was a teenager, slightly sideways, like he's ready to move either direction. He stood in our front doorway for a moment, then hugged his mother for a long time. Then he hugged me. He said I should have called Corinne back in September and said something stronger than no. I told him no was enough. He said it hadn't been. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Irene and I had had 100,000 ordinary meals, and I spread out the documents. Eric read through them carefully. He asked questions in the methodical way I apparently passed on to both children, though only one of them had done anything decent with it. When he finished, he closed the folder. She told me you were forgetting things, he said. She sent me a list. Incidents, the Canadian Tire story, a supposed argument you had with a neighbor that the neighbor apparently reported, an emergency room visit she said you'd had but kept secret. He looked at me. I called your neighbor, old Harvey on the corner. He said you two had a conversation about his fence line and shook hands at the end of it. No argument. I checked my health card connections on Service Nova Scotia. No ER visit on record for your provincial health number. She fabricated them, I said. She fabricated them, he confirmed. He sounded the way I must have sounded sitting in Janet's office, level, because the alternative was something neither of us could afford yet. The night before the hearing, Irene and I sat on the back porch. October in Nova Scotia can still have evenings like this, cool but not cold, the sky going dark over the Bedford basin, the maple a shadow against a navy blue sky. Irene had a wool blanket over her lap. We didn't talk much. At some point she said, I want to stay in this house. Just that. I said, I know, we will. She said, promise? I said, yes. I don't make promises I haven't thought through. 53 years, she knows that. The hearing was held in Halifax at the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, a building on Upper Water Street that I'd walked past hundreds of times without ever imagining I'd be inside it for this reason. Janet met us in the lobby. Eric stood on my left. Irene held my arm. Corinne and Brent sat at the petitioner's table with Derek Holloway. Corinne was dressed carefully, professional, subdued. She didn't look at us when we came in. Brent looked once and then away. Holloway had the particular confidence of someone who hadn't yet understood the shape of the day. The judge was a man named Justice Pemberton, 60-something. Bald, the kind of judicial manner that is neither warm nor cold but simply precise. He had 30 years on the bench. He'd seen everything. I hope that included this. Holloway opened with the application summary: cognitive decline, safety concerns, family's genuine desire to ensure proper care. He presented signed statements. Corinne's, Brent's, two of their friends I'd met perhaps 3 times combined. He submitted a report from a geriatric assessment clinic. I hadn't been to any geriatric assessment clinic. Janet had already flagged this. The report used a client identifier number that didn't match my provincial health card. Someone had either fabricated the report or used another patient's assessment under my name. The clinic itself, when Janet's office contacted them, had no record of seeing me. Janet stood. My lord, before the court proceeds further on the basis of the submitted documentation, I'd like to enter a preliminary motion regarding the authenticity of several exhibits. Justice Pemberton looked over his glasses at her. Proceed, Miss Forsyth. She entered the forensic report on the tracking device. She entered the registration records showing the email account in Brent's name. She entered the transmission logs, 63 recorded location transmissions from October 7th onward. She entered a screenshot of the medical assessment report alongside the health authority's written confirmation that no such assessment of Walter Ashford had taken place at that clinic or any affiliated facility. She entered Eric's written statement about the September phone call, in which Corinne had asked him to co-sign the application and listed fabricated incidents as justification. She entered a statement from Harvey Melanson, our neighbor of 19 years, describing the fence conversation and its entirely civil conclusion. She entered a letter from Dr. Cartry. I read it when Janet showed it to me the day before. It was 12 lines long and said, in the measured language of a physician who has been practicing for 30 years, that I was in excellent cognitive and physical health, that my regular appointments showed no signs of decline, that I had managed a complex medical question about Irene's cardiac medication independently and accurately at our last visit, and that the suggestion of incompetence was, in his professional opinion, entirely without foundation. She entered Ted Barlow's statement about our ongoing correspondence regarding our investment portfolio. Detailed, accurate, independent correspondence. No assistance required or sought. Holloway objected, procedurally, technically, repeatedly. Justice Pemberton allowed the objections and overruled them one by one with the economy of a man who does not enjoy having his time wasted. Then Janet asked for a brief recess and conferred with an officer of the court. When we resumed, she said, "My lord, I would ask the court to hear briefly from Mr. and Mrs. Ashford's grandson." I looked at Janet. She had told me this was a last resort. Her expression told me the other evidence was enough, but that what Noah had to say was something the court should hear on its own merits, separate from our case, because what had been done to Noah was its own matter. Noah had been brought to court by Eric, who had collected him from school that morning with Corinne's knowledge, because Eric, as Noah's uncle, had that right, and because Corinne apparently hadn't fought to prevent it. He sat in a small anteroom with a family court support worker while we were in session. He was brought in now, and he sat in the witness chair with his hands folded, the way Irene folds her hands, and described, in the flat, careful tone of a kid who has rehearsed honesty rather than lines, exactly what his mother had asked him to say, what he had been told to repeat, and what the truth actually was. He described the Canadian Tire. He described Grandma's prescription pickup. He described Brent's conversation about the house being sold and the money put somewhere that worked for everyone. He said, near the end, "My mum told me I'd be helping Grandpa by saying those things. But the things she told me to say weren't true, and I don't think lying to help someone is actually helping them." He said this with the directness of someone who has been thinking about it for some time and finally had a place to put it. When he left the room, Justice Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something at length on the document in front of him. The ruling took 11 minutes. The application for personal directorship was dismissed in full. Justice Pemberton found no evidence of cognitive decline and significant evidence of premeditated financial exploitation. He referred the matter to the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service for review of potential criminal charges under the Criminal Code, fraud, and Section 718.2's provisions related to the abuse of vulnerable persons. He referred the fabricated medical report to the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the RCMP for investigation. He referred Derek Holloway to the Nova Scotia Barristers Society for disciplinary review. He issued a protection order prohibiting Corinne and Brent from accessing any financial information related to our estate, accounts, or property. He said before he concluded, "The use of a child to manufacture evidence in proceedings of this nature is among the most troubling things this court has occasion to address. This will be reflected in any subsequent proceedings." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Outside in the corridor, Eric put his arm around my shoulders. Irene stood on my other side. Janet shook my hand and said she would be in touch about next steps, which she said with the practical briskness of someone who knows that endings are never quite endings and that the work continues. I thanked her. She said I was easy to represent, which I understood to mean that telling the truth on a consistent basis makes a lawyer's job considerably simpler. We went to lunch, the three of us, at a place on the waterfront that Irene likes. Noah joined us, because Eric had picked him up from the courthouse support room, and he had nowhere else to be that afternoon. He ordered the fish and chips and ate every bite. He seemed lighter than he'd been in months. Kids carry things without showing you the weight of them, and then one day you notice them set something down. In November, Corinne and Brent retained a family law solicitor. The Public Prosecution Service opened a file. The fabricated medical report was traced to the assessment clinic's administrative software. Someone had accessed the system using a staff login and created a record that was never entered into the clinic's actual files. That investigation was ongoing as of the last time Janet updated us. Irene and I stayed in our house, obviously. We've been here 40 years, and we'll be here, God and the Halifax weather willing, for whatever comes next. The maple in the backyard dropped its leaves in November, the way it does every year. I raked them up on a Saturday morning while Irene had her coffee on the porch with a blanket on her lap, watching me the way she's watched me do yard work for half a century. Noah comes twice a week, same as always. He's doing a project on Canadian civil law for social studies. He asks good questions. The antique clock is in Janet's office. Evidence still. I bought Irene a new clock for the mantelpiece. Plain, wooden, nothing fancy. It keeps good time. That's all a clock needs to do. What I want to say to anyone watching this, who is in a similar situation, who feels things shifting around them in ways they can't quite name, who keeps explaining away the small wrong things, the pamphlet that appeared, the questions about driving, the gentle suggestions about options, is this: your instinct that something is wrong is not paranoia, it's information. Document everything. Write down the date and what was said and who was there. Call a solicitor who specializes in elder law before you think you need one. In Nova Scotia, in Ontario, in BC, in every province there are people who handle exactly this, and the earlier you call them, the more options you have. And if you are watching this, and you are the child of aging parents, the home your parents built is not an inheritance waiting to be unlocked. It is the place where they live. The life they are still living is not an inconvenience to be managed. It is theirs. Some things are very simple, even when we make them complicated. Irene read me something last week from the book she's been reading, a quote she said she wanted me to have. She's been doing this for 53 years, finding things in books that she thinks I need, reading them aloud in her teacher's voice, watching to see if they land. I never tell her when they don't. This one did. It was this: the purpose of the law is not to punish the strong for being strong. It is to protect the ordinary life, the daily life, the unremarkable life from being taken. She closed the book and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. That's what happened, she said. They tried to take our ordinary life. I said yes. She said they didn't get it. I said no, they didn't. She smiled and went back to her book. That's the whole of it, really. They didn't get it, and we're still here. There's a thing I'd noticed, looking back at all of it, that I don't think I could have articulated while it was happening. The people who tried to take our life from us weren't stupid. They were, in their own way, quite deliberate. They understood that the easiest way to move something is to convince the thing being moved that the movement is for its own good. That's what made it dangerous, not the greed. Greed is obvious once you know to look for it. What made it dangerous was the patience, the slow layering of small suggestions, the pamphlet on the counter, the gentle questions about driving, the way Corinne said options as though it were a kindness. What stopped it wasn't luck. I want to be honest about that, because I think people sometimes hear a story like this and call the outcome fortunate, and I don't think that's quite right. What stopped it was that Irene noticed the clock was heavy, that I sat at the kitchen table at midnight instead of going to bed, that I called Janet Forsyth the following Monday instead of waiting to see if things settled on their own. Those were choices, not accidents. Small ones made under uncertainty, without knowing yet how serious the situation was. But they were choices. I think about Noah a lot, about the position he was put in, asked to carry a version of events that he knew at 12 years old was false. He could have repeated what he was told. Most adults in his situation would have found a way to rationalize it. But he came to the kitchen table and told me what his mother had asked him to say, and then told me what was actually true, and the effort that took, the quiet moral courage of it, is not something I take for granted. Nobody told him to do that in a classroom. He arrived at it through the simple, difficult decision to trust what he knew over what he'd been instructed. I am prouder of him for that than for anything else I watched him do that year. Eric flew in from Calgary without being asked twice. Janet worked through the evidence with the precision of someone who understands that justice is not a feeling, it is a documented sequence of facts presented clearly to the right people at the right time. Dr. Cartry wrote 12 lines that said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. Ted Barlow signed a statement he didn't have to sign. Harvey Melanson wrote a letter about a fence conversation. These things happened because people chose to be honest and to show up, and those choices had consequences that the other side hadn't calculated for. The people who build these schemes, and I understand now that there are schemes, that what happened to us has happened before and will happen again, they count on silence. They count on the person being targeted to doubt themselves, to wait, to explain things away, to be embarrassed by their own suspicion. They count on the rest of the family to stay out of it. They count on the institutions being slow. They count on the institutions being slow. They count on time. What I would say to anyone in a situation that feels like this one even slightly is, your clarity is not paranoia. An instinct that something is wrong is information worth taking seriously. Write things down, call someone who knows the law. Tell the people you trust what you're seeing. The machinery of exploitation runs on the assumption that you won't do those things, and when you do, it tends to run aground rather quickly. Irene and I are still in our house. The maple is bare now, and the basin is grey, and on Thursday mornings I still drive out to the golf course and lose 2 holes out of 3 to men I've known for 25 years. None of that changed, which is precisely the point. The ordinary life, the unremarkable, daily, decent ordinary life, was worth protecting, and it was worth whatever it cost to protect it.